Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are you allowing your politics to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson, and let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. We have with us today Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. We also have Ms. Carmela Monk-Crawford, who's the editor of Message Magazine. We also have with us Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Washington liaison for the North American division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we also have with us Jennifer Woods, who's the director of government affairs for the World Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies, it's a pleasure having you here with us today, and welcome to Faith and Politics. Let's just get right into segment one. Segment one is really talking about an issue that in about 1993, different presidents of the United States have created by executive order this event that they call the National Freedom Day or National Religious Freedom Day. And it's something that I'm wondering, is that gone too far? We're supposed to be a nation of obviously being able to do what you'd like to do from a religious standpoint. But if the government is creating a specific religious freedom day, aren't they going too far and maybe even stepping into the Establishment Clause in some way? Bettina, help me to understand what's going on with that.
Well, Orlin, I mean, what a question. But I really scratched my head when I thought about it because, you know, the day itself is not just for people who are religious. It is also for the atheists, for the humanists, for the free thinkers. It's their day as well, because it is a day that celebrates this historical reality that America is founded on a secular constitution.
Got it.
That reality, to me, is worth celebrating, regardless of whether you believe or don't believe.
So, Carmela, it sounds like this day is really a day to celebrate your freedom to either be religious or not be religious. Do I have that right, or what are your thoughts on that?
I agree. You asked whether, has this gone too far and whether this is something that is acknowledging or establishing religion. It's just acknowledging you have the freedom to worship the way according to the dictates of your conscience, or not to worship at all, or not to even hold any religious beliefs. So in that respect, I would say, no, it's not too far. And yes, you're right. I think that is just an opportunity to say that's who we are as a company. It's sort of like you ever been in one of those situations where you're looking at a mirror and you can see yourself looking at the mirror and see yourself looking at the mirror, see yourself. That's exactly what this is. We're just saying there is no set way. It's just, this is who we are, freedom of religion and freedom of conscience.
But Jennifer, let me ask you this. Last time I checked, I didn't see freedom to speak whatever I want day, or some of my other inalienable right freedoms days. What makes this day special? I know that went back to the work that Thomas Jefferson did back in Virginia, but there's something that seems to be more special about this as opposed to celebrating days of all of our other inalienable rights that we have here in this country. Tell me about what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I think that really this comes to celebrating one of our basic rights to talk about our human dignity, again, to believe as we want, to worship or not worship as we choose without there being repercussions from the government. And I think the important thing here is, again, this day as it's designed is not to promote religion or to celebrate religion or the impact religion has had, is to celebrate the freedom to choose to be religious or not, or to worship or to not worship. And I think as long, again, as the emphasis is on the freedom aspect and not on the promoting of religion, then we don't run into any issues with the Establishment Clause. Again, this is one of our First Amendment rights, and it is very fundamental, in some ways very different than some of the other rights that we have.
You know, Melissa, let me ask you, have you seen groups that celebrate on this day and what they've done as a way to kind of like highlight the day and not necessarily use it as a club to really offend others? What have you seen in the past, and what can people probably be thinking about doing in the future on a day like that?
Sure. Well, the organization that I work for, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we actually host a religious freedom prayer breakfast in order to honor this Religious Freedom Day. And, you know, one thing I want to say is I love that this day exists. For a couple of different reasons. One is because it points back to our history as a nation, right? And sort of where the government's posture was on this particular, and I think unfortunately as a society, we need that reminder, you know, that we were a nation founded on respecting, you know, minority faith traditions or no faith traditions at all. The other thing I would say is I really do feel like it is an opportunity for people of faith to celebrate that you know, we are part of society and we actually benefit the larger community. So, you know, yeah, absolutely emphasis on the freedom component, but I think also it's an opportunity, much like the prayer breakfast that I mentioned, for all different faith traditions to come together and say, we as member, you know, as faithful people care about our community and the betterment of it. And so I feel like there's just a real opportunity in highlighting religious freedom at any opportunity. Don't just wait for that one day.
Well, you know, Carmela, it sounds like this is really an opportunity for one group to find out more about another group. Because what I've found out is almost many religious groups, they're insular in nature. They spend a lot of time with each other, but very little time going, quote unquote, across the religious aisle to find out what's going on. Do you see this as being a day where we all should be celebrating the fact that whether you worship in a synagogue or a church or a mosque, that what this country is all about is that you should be free to do it all? Is that your thoughts, or what have you been thinking on that concept?
Well, you kind of lost me on the last part about we should be free to do it all. It's one of those things, you hold your religious beliefs very closely. And I do agree that this would be an opportunity to start a conversation with someone who maybe would believe differently than you do. This is what in some ways unrealistic. So many of us are, just like you say, insular. We associate with people who believe the way we do.
Right.
But for, as what Melissa said a moment ago, you know, an occasion as an interfaith prayer breakfast or an occasion, you have to be intentional about seeing someone else and seeing what the impact of their life would be, or how it could be different if they didn't have those freedoms. We may take it for granted. Being a Protestant growing up in a Christian country, there are plenty of other people who may see this as very dear and very hard fought.
So, Bettina, it sounds like this is something that maybe even people of faith should take even more seriously. If nothing else, maybe this is an opportunity to take a day to learn about somebody else's faith. Because how can we ever pull together a group that may be part of a coalition if we don't know anything about each other? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've been listening to each of the panelists talking about how this day is special, how it's an opportunity to learn about people of other faiths. But I think for me, the opportunity of this day is more about education, because let's face it, demographics in this country are changing. I mean, 3 in 10 American adults right now have no religious affiliation. And that number, I mean, sociologists are tracking that number as it's going up and up and up. So, you know, the America that we're talking about today will not be the America that we know in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. So this day is not just a day to celebrate, it's a day to educate and help people understand, people who don't hold any faith, help them understand why religious freedom is a cornerstone liberty for democracy, not just a special treatment for people of faith. It is a cornerstone liberty. And I think we've got a lot of work to do in getting that education moving forward.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll make that the last word on that, but it's such an essential point, that understanding that my religious freedom is tied to other people's religious freedom, and taking some time to learn about who they are makes that whole process a whole lot smoother. Well, let's go to our next segment. I wanted to talk about a segment regarding courtroom invocations. There have been a few matters where a few judges have actually created an environment where they allowed to have an invocation that would take place in the courtrooms. Now, this is one of those areas that gets a little bit dicey. It's almost like a prayer in school, or what does an invocation mean? Is there any religious connotations that are attached to it? We had a judge by the name of Wayne Mack who had some other activities he was going on with, but he started to reality check himself when others started pushing back regarding, can you be doing this from an invocation standpoint? So I wanted to start with Jennifer to talk about invocations in the courtrooms. Good idea, bad idea, over the line, or making just too big a deal of it?
Yeah, I think it really depends on how it's being carried out. So, for example, in this instance with Judge Mack, he set up this chaplaincy program. It was mostly Christian chaplains who were part of this program. They got to read from the Bible. They gave a prayer. And while he would allow people to leave the courtroom if they didn't feel comfortable, there's this element of coercion, of people feeling like they might not get equal treatment from him because he's in this position of judging, like literally judging the outcome of matters before him. And so I think that, depending on how it's done, it can be done in a way that is less coercive than this one, at least to me, appears to be.
So, Bettina, how can you do this in a less coercive manner? You want to actually be true to who an individual is, because just because you show up at your job doesn't mean you're a different person. And an invocation and maybe something of that nature is something the judge is very comfortable with. But how do we do it in a way where it doesn't become coercive, or the fact that somebody may want to engage in it just because they're hoping to have good favor with the judge?
Yeah, well, before I answer that, let me go back to something that Jennifer said, and that was, that it could be, and in this case, feels a little coercive. I want to push back just a little on that, because in America, we have a very long tradition of what we call of civil religion. And this is religious activities which are shaped by history and tradition. I mean, you have a line of Supreme Court cases that have ruled on this sort of benign religious activity, which is sort of seen as more historical and cultural rather than an actual act of worship. So, what I see happening in Judge Mack's courtroom is not as coercive as other instances where the court has held that this is still a benign practice of civil religion, which doesn't cross the line. So, going back to what Jennifer said, it is a subjective call. It is a difficult area. But I think, as Chief Justice Burgess said in a case back in 1983, really, history has shown us that even though we've had this element of religion in our civic activities, it hasn't crossed the Establishment Clause line in any meaningful way. It hasn't caused a problem. So history actually teaches us that, there are some acts of religion in a public space which are benign.
Well, Carmela, I look at it a little bit differently. The fact of the matter is that we know that almost anything you do from a religious standpoint or even an invocation standpoint is probably going to offend somebody. Why just not shut it off completely? Just don't go down that road. And none of us never have to worry about it. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think that's a right plan of attack in terms of just safeguarding the opportunity or the potential of offending anyone?
I have to be honest. I tend to weigh in on that side of things. I practiced in Ohio, where the state seal is behind the judge's desk and it says, "In God we trust." And that's on our money too, right? And It does seem like a benign expression, like as Bettina says, is a civil religion and sort of more traditional than anything. But I would hate to be the defendant that walks into the courtroom who does not have that kind of belief and believes that even the invocation would be offensive. I would hate to be there to sense that if I don't want to participate in that, how is this judge going to look at me?
Mm.
You know, how is he going to consider my case? He's going to look at me as a godless, faithless, someone who couldn't even take a moment just out of kindness to respect our religion. I don't like it.
So, Melissa, what do you think about that? Because I think Carmela is bringing up some great points. I'm coming in to see a judge, somebody who basically may have my life in his hands, and that individual wants to have an invocation, and in the midst of it, I'm just staring at him like nothing's going on. That may work against me. Is it going too far? Or what's the safety route on it? Or what do you think from a societal standpoint is the road we need to go down?
Yeah, I think we should probably give our judges a little bit more credit than that. But I guess what I was going to say was, I thought of a couple of instances, the military and the chaplaincy program that's involved there, and how appreciated that is by our service members. Again, it's completely voluntary to participate, interact at all with the chaplaincy. But again, some service members really appreciate that is provided by the U.S. military. And then also, I think of the chaplain of the Senate, and then of course the chaplain of the House of Representatives, and how much that those individuals are appreciated by those members of Congress. Again, I know that those gentlemen, they host weekly Bible studies. Of course, they open sessions with prayer and things like that. Those are optional things for the members to participate in. But again, I've heard anecdotally that they're very much appreciated by the members. And so again, as long as we don't cross that line, that Jennifer mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, which is so essential as far as coercion and really being aware and diligent that we don't do that, I really do see a lot of benefits for this sort of chaplaincy program.
But Jennifer, I got to ask you this, though. The idea is that in Congress, those individuals agree to this. They decided as a group they're comfortable with this. But if I come into a courtroom, I don't get a chance to weigh in on that. I'm just somebody on the outside. Jennifer, why don't you let me hear what you have to say, and then Carmela, I want to hear after you after that.
Yeah, I think, again, it comes down to this power dynamic, right? When you're dealing with a courtroom and a judge that is promoting this program, and they're in a position of power, and you're coming before them to make an ask or to hope that they're going to decide in your favor, and you feel like you may be able to get some additional, points for staying for this moment of prayer, even if it's against what you believe, I think that that's where the problem is. It's how it's done. How much, what are the power dynamics at play when these programs are, such as invocations are in place? And I know that some people may argue that, we want to be able to, that God has a place, we want to be able to wear our Christianity out, out in public and in public service. And that's fine, but you don't have to, there are ways to do that besides forcing or requiring, even in a voluntary way, by people thinking that they're going to get some benefit from it, other than believing in the invocation itself. There are ways to wear your Christianity without having invocations where people might not feel comfortable being there.
Carmela, you get the last word on this.
Well, I just have to say, and just reiterating, Melissa said something that made me smile. We should give our judges more credit than that. And I respect the bench and the robe. I know that the people who wear the robes hold their faith and their beliefs closely like the rest of us. And it would be very hard to separate what somebody feels very closely in that instance. And so I think it's important. I also think, who else gets to offer the invocation? And what all is a part of that invocation? If you had somebody else who had a tradition, a faith tradition, or practices vastly different from a Christian perspective, are you willing to be a part of that right before you go into court? I don't know. It would make people feel uncomfortable.
Well, I got to tell you, it's a fascinating conversation, and it's topics that I can see why we'll always have questions about it. But we're going to move on to our third section. And in this section, we have a major case that just came before the Supreme Court. Many people who probably don't even know anything about the law probably know the phrase Roe v. Wade. And Roe v. Wade has been some law that's been in place for probably over 50 years. We have a case that came before the Supreme Court, which was called the Dobbs case, dealing with the issue of abortion. And it actually looks like this is a topic they may start to change a little bit. Now, we don't want to get into whether someone's for or against, but this is looking like it could be a transformational change in what may be happening in our country as it relates to what's going on in a quote unquote woman's right to choose. Jennifer, tell me a little bit about this case and what this could mean for the future if we continue to look at potentially where this might be going.
Sure. So in this particular case, there's a clinic that was challenging a state law that would ban abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. And this would change the current status of the law, which says that, allowing for abortions until the baby is viable. And so this would severely restrict a woman's right to have an abortion that she's currently granted in most states. And for me, the issue that I see here is I always have issues with legislation from the bench and where that line is drawn between a judge who's interpreting the law and one who is creating new law through maybe a more aggressive, aggressively trying to create law. And I'm struggling with where that line is. So maybe some of the other panelists can help in fleshing that out a little bit.
So Carmela, that's got to be the line. The question is, when are you actually making law as opposed to interpreting law? If you take a look at this case, what did it feel like to you? Did it feel like making, or did it feel like interpreting, or was it something else?
I'm going to go with making for 400, Alex. I think definitely this has been clear. And we know, and we unfortunately, or fortunately, we can't turn a blind eye to the vast efforts that are being made so that this is exactly what happens, that the law is overturned and reversed. And so, I think that's where we are.
Geez, Bettina, where is this going to end up? Are we going to start seeing every state starting to maybe tweak things a little bit? Or is this going to be something where maybe the Supreme Court gets another case in where they may decide, you know what, let's really come with a definitive statement on this? What are your thoughts on the Dobbs case?
Sure. Well, a lot of pundits are saying, yes, the constitutional right that currently exists for abortion will be overturned. And if that happens, in the short term, there's, I believe, 12 states that have so-called trigger laws, that as soon as the Supreme Court overturns Roe, then a ban against abortion, complete ban, goes into effect. On the other side, there's something like 15 states, I believe, that also have trigger laws saying that if Roe is overturned, then abortion will be legal in those states. So what you're going to see is a patchwork of approaches. But, all in a case that we haven't talked about, but which sort of goes hand in glove with this case, is a case about a Texas abortion law, which is sort of been traveling in tandem with the Dobbs case. The Supreme Court declined to stay this Texas law. But I want to talk about this law, Orlin, because to me, this is where, as an advocate for civil rights, this is where I start crying fire, because the mechanism of this law in Texas, which is currently in effect, is that if abortion takes place beyond a certain period of time, right, then someone, just an ordinary member of the public, can bring a civil suit, and collect $10,000. And that is simply to avoid the involvement of state officials. Right. And so what you've got here is a law that has been specifically designed and created to sidestep a constitutionally protected right. Now, no matter what you think about abortion, that is concerning to me. And I think we need to look at it and try to look at this situation without the emotional trigger of the abortion issue and say, is that what we want legislatures to do?
Melissa, I got to ask you, and Bettina pretty much starts to summarize that. our country feels like it's turning into a place where they're getting more comfortable with patchwork as opposed to federal legislation that puts us in a position where we are the United States of America. We are starting to look like the regional states of America. And depending on your region, it almost seems like a Supreme Court could potentially rule in that direction. I mean, is that what we're seeing happening with a lot of these cases now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're exactly right as far as the directional push. I think another thing that's really interesting to look at is sort of the way that we've seen around this particular issue, incremental change over the last couple of decades, whether it's, term limits or health and safety violations and things like that. They've always been very incremental steps and sort of almost in a posture of waiting for society to sort of get closer together on this issue. But we haven't seen society get closer together on this issue, right? And so it's now interesting to me that we are seeing this approach both in Mississippi and in Texas of we're going to kind of take matters into our own hands, right? Where we have the authority to be able to do so. So to me, I find that very interesting. Again, from a civil liberties perspective, as Bettina mentioned, more troubling.
Jennifer, I'm going to give you the last word on this. So we are a society that really is deciding we don't want the federal governments to do anything, and we're comfortable if we just allow judges sometimes to make the law.
I think that there are times we can look at the history where judges making the law has not been a bad thing, like Brown versus Board of Education. Society was not there, and the judges took action and kind of created law there. They made new precedent. So I can't say that's always a bad thing, but yes, I think we're coming back into that time again where there's a lot of more judicial activism than we've seen in the past.
Boy, thank you so much for that conversation, ladies. And it is an issue that I think we'll be talking about for quite some time to go. Why don't we get to our last segment? Our segment's just basically saying, tell me something I don't know. I'm going to start with Carmela. Carmela, tell me something I don't know.
Well, did you know that there is a rural conservative match point to souls to the polls? Have you heard that in Georgia?
No.
A few short years ago, people were up in arms. We can't have these big Black churches getting out on Sunday, taking people straight to the polls and thus shifting the elections their way. But now in Georgia, they're saying people in rural areas, people who are conservatives need to have the flexibility of a open Sunday election site and all that sort of thing. And we're saying, welcome to the club. Everybody should have free access to the poll as often as possible.
Wow. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Yeah, so I think what's going to happen with Judge Mack, which is a fantastic name, is that we're going to see a lot more diversity in the types of faith officials that participate in the programs. If the programs still continue, I think they will still continue. But that's my prediction as far as the Judge Mack situation.
Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, Olin, I'm going straight overseas with this one. This is a bee in my bonnet at the present, and that is the Olympic Games, which have just finished in China. Did you know that you have just witnessed a multi-billion-dollar international public relations effort designed to detract the world's attention away from China's persecution of Uyghur Muslims and Tibetan Buddhists? Let's just leave it there.
Wow. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Wow. Well, I'm going to go back to Judge Mack and the invocation issue. And even just recently today, I was reading a news article about a local board in Michigan who was sued by, again, these two parties, had the two parties involved, First Liberty and FRFF, and they decided to get rid of their invocation before their meetings altogether. And so I think that we're going to see more of these issues happening of courts and boards and local governments trying to grapple with whether to have prayer. If they do have an invocation, who gets invited to give the invocation, or do we just do away with it altogether?
Wow, interesting stuff. Ladies, thank you so much for being with us on Faith and Politics today. Well, we've come to the end of another session of Faith and Politics. We're just glad you were able to be here with us. The bottom line is, if it's about God and it's about government, it's about faith and politics. See you next time.